Picture this, a lone human 50,000 years ago standing at the edge of a forest. No police, no courts, no government, just survival. Now fast forward to today, where nearly every aspect of your life is governed by laws, regulations, and institutions. What happened in between? The answer might disturb you. Everything we call civilization, every law we follow, every government we obey, was born not from peace and cooperation, but from humanity's most destructive impulse, war. This is the story of how violence created order, how bloodshed built society, and how the worst of human nature paradoxically gave us the best of our institutions. Let's go back to the beginning, to a time when humans lived in small bands of maybe 20 to 50 people. These weren't societies as we know them. They were extended families moving through landscapes in search of food, with no written rules, no formal leaders, and no permanent structures. Decisions were made collectively, usually by respected elders or skilled hunters. Disputes were settled through reputation, shame, or occasionally violence. But here's the thing. This worked perfectly fine for tens of thousands of years. So why did it change? The answer is simple and brutal. When two groups wanted the same resources, someone had to lose. And losing meant death. The first conflicts weren't wars as we understand them today. They were raids, ambushes, and skirmishes over hunting grounds, water sources, or territory. Archaeological evidence from sites across the world tells a grim story. In Jebel Sahaba, in modern-day Sudan, researchers discovered a cemetery dating back 13,000 years containing the remains of 61 people, many showing signs of violent death from arrows and spears. This wasn't a single massacre. The victims died over time, suggesting ongoing conflict. Similar evidence appears in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Violence wasn't an aberration in prehistoric life. It was woven into the fabric of human existence. But these early conflicts were chaotic, unorganized, and devastating to everyone involved. Then came the agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 years ago. And everything changed. When humans learned to cultivate crops and domesticated animals, they stopped moving, they built permanent settlements, they stored surplus food, and suddenly they had something worth stealing. A nomadic hunter-gatherer band might have tools, furs, and perhaps some dried meat, but a farming village had fields of grain, herds of livestock, and stores that could feed a community for months. This created an entirely new problem. How do you defend what you can't carry away? The answer was organization. Villages needed to coordinate their defense, post guards, and prepare for attacks. They needed leaders who could make quick decisions in times of crisis. They needed rules about who fights, who guards the food, and what happens to those who refuse. War demanded structure, and structure was the seed of government. The earliest evidence of organized warfare appears in the archaeological record around the same time as the first permanent settlements. In Catalhoyuk, a Neolithic settlement in modern Turkey dating to 7,500 BCE, researchers found something unexpected. No fortifications, no defensive walls, and little evidence of warfare. But this changed. By 5000 BCE, settlements across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley were building massive walls, watchtowers, and defensive structures. These weren't just physical barriers. They represented a fundamental shift in human organization. Building a wall requires planning, labor coordination, resource allocation, and a leadership structure capable of directing hundreds or thousands of people toward a common goal. You can't build a 30-foot wall by committee. Someone has to be in charge. This brings us to Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the first true cities emerged around 4000 BCE. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash weren't just larger villages. They were complex societies with populations in the tens of thousands. And they were constantly at war with each other. The famous Stele of the Vultures, dating to about 2500 BCE, depicts the victory of Eannatum, king of Lagash, over the rival city of Umma. The carved stone shows organized infantry formations, soldiers marching in tight ranks behind large shields, led by a king. This wasn't a mob rushing into battle, this was a disciplined military force, and discipline requires hierarchy, command structures, and rules. The Sumerian city-states developed some of humanity's first written laws, not despite war, but because of it. Consider the logistics of fielding an army. You need to recruit soldiers, which means taking them away from their farms and workshops. Someone has to feed them while they're fighting. Someone has to make their weapons and armor. Someone has to decide when to attack and when to retreat. And crucially, someone has to ensure that soldiers follow orders, even when those orders might lead to their death. This requires a level of social organization that simply didn't exist before. The Sumerians solved this problem by creating a bureaucratic class of scribes, administrators, and officials who managed the city's resources, tracked food stores, and organized military campaigns. These bureaucrats needed rules to operate by, standardized procedures for allocating resources, and legal frameworks for resolving disputes. War didn't just encourage the development of government, it made government absolutely necessary. The Code of Onamu, written around 2100 BCE, is the oldest known law code in existence, predating even the famous Code of Hammurabi by about 300 years. What's fascinating is how many of its laws deal directly or indirectly with issues of violence, property, and social order, all things that become critical in times of war. The code established fines for various offenses, standardized weights and measures, and protected the weak from exploitation. But why? Because a society at war cannot afford internal chaos. If soldiers are worried about their families being cheated, their land being stolen, or disputes erupting while they're away fighting, they won't be effective warriors. Laws created predictability and stability on the home front, which translated directly into military effectiveness on the battlefield. Ancient Egypt provides another compelling example. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, traditionally attributed to King Narmer, was achieved through military conquest. The famous Narmer palette depicts the king smiting his enemies, a visual representation of how violence created political unity. But once Egypt was unified, it faced a new problem. How do you keep it unified? The pharaohs developed one of the most sophisticated governmental systems in the ancient world, with a hierarchy of officials, governors, tax collectors, and judges, all reporting ultimately to the divine king. This wasn't created for philosophical reasons, it was a practical necessity. Egypt faced constant threats from Nubian kingdoms to the south, Libyan tribes to the west, and various Near Eastern powers to the northeast. Managing these threats required mobilizing Egypt's vast resources, coordinating armies, and maintaining order across hundreds of miles of territory. The ancient Egyptians developed extensive legal codes and administrative procedures, though most haven't survived in the same way Mesopotamian texts have. But we know from records that Egypt had courts, judges, and standardized punishments for crimes. We know they had a complex tax system that funded both the military and the massive building projects that defined their civilization, and we know that the entire system was oriented around maintaining order and projecting power. The pyramids, often thought of as monuments to vanity, were actually demonstrations of organizational capability. A pharaoh who could mobilize the labor, resources, and logistics to build a pyramid could certainly mobilize an army. The monuments were warnings to potential enemies: attack us, and you face a society capable of moving millions of tons of stone. Let's jump forward to ancient China, where the Warring States period, from 475 to 221 BCE, perfectly illustrates how war drives governmental innovation. 7 major states competed for supremacy, engaging in increasingly sophisticated military campaigns involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This period saw an explosion of philosophical and political thought, not coincidentally. Thinkers like Confucius, Sun Tzu, and Han Feizi all grappled with the same fundamental question. How do you create a society strong enough to survive in a world of constant conflict? Sun Tzu's The Art of War wasn't just a military manual. It was a treatise on organization, leadership, and strategy that applied to governance as much as warfare. The state of Qin, which eventually conquered all the others and unified China, did so in large part because of its superior governmental organization. The Qin adopted legalism, a philosophy that emphasized strict laws, harsh punishments, and centralized authority. The legalist philosopher Han Feizi argued that human nature was fundamentally selfish, and that only through clear laws and severe consequences could order be maintained. This might sound harsh, but it worked. Qin created a meritocratic bureaucracy where positions were awarded based on ability rather than birth, standardized weights and measures across its territory, and implemented a legal code so strict that even minor infractions received serious punishment. This created a disciplined, organized society capable of mobilizing for war more effectively than any of its rivals. By 221 BCE, Qin had conquered all other states and established the first unified Chinese empire. The Qin dynasty didn't last long. It collapsed just 15 years after unification, but it established a model of centralized bureaucratic government that would define China for the next 2,000 years. And that model was forged entirely in the crucible of war. The imperial examination system, the administrative provinces, the standardized legal codes, all of these innovations came from the need to organize society for military competition. Peace, paradoxically, came from perfecting the tools of war. Now let's look at the classical world of Greece and Rome, where war played an equally central role in shaping government, but with a different outcome. The Greek city-states, particularly Athens, are often celebrated as the birthplace of democracy. But Athenian democracy wasn't created in a vacuum. It emerged from military necessity. In the early 6th century BCE, Athens was a society dominated by aristocrats, where political power was restricted to wealthy landowners. But Athens faced threats from rival city-states and the massive Persian Empire. To defend itself, Athens needed soldiers, and not just a few aristocratic warriors. It needed thousands of citizen soldiers willing to fight in the phalanx, the tight formation of heavily armed infantry that dominated Greek warfare. The problem was simple. Why would ordinary citizens risk their lives to defend a government that gave them no voice? The solution was radical. Extend political rights to those who serve in the military. The reforms of Solon, Cleisthenes, and later leaders gradually expanded citizenship rights, giving ordinary Athenians the right to vote in the assembly, serve on juries, and hold public office. This wasn't altruism, it was practical necessity. A citizen who has a stake in the government will fight to defend it. A citizen who has no voice has no reason to die for the state. Athenian democracy was, in essence, a military recruitment strategy that evolved into a political system. The connection between military service and political rights became even clearer during the Persian Wars. When Xerxes invaded Greece in 480 BCE with the largest army the world had ever seen, Athens faced annihilation. The Athenian response was the Battle of Salamis, a naval engagement where Athens' fleet, manned by thousands of ordinary citizens serving as rowers, destroyed the Persian navy and saved Greece. These weren't aristocrats. They were common men, craftsmen and merchants who couldn't afford the armor and weapons needed for the phalanx but who could row a trireme. After Salamis, these men demanded and received political rights. The Thetes, the lowest class of citizens, became full participants in Athenian democracy. War had fundamentally reshaped the political order. Rome took this dynamic even further. The Roman Republic began as a city-state governed by aristocratic families, but constant warfare transformed it into something unprecedented. A republic where political rights and military service were inextricably linked. Roman citizens were expected to serve in the legions, and in return, they received political rights, a share of conquered land, and protection under Roman law. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, created in 450 BCE, established legal protections for ordinary citizens, standardized punishments, and limited the arbitrary power of aristocrats. Why? Because Rome needed its citizens to fight, and citizens needed to know that the state would protect their rights in return. The Roman military system itself was a form of government. The legions weren't just fighting forces, they were political institutions. Commanders had to navigate complex relationships with their soldiers, the Senate, and the Roman people. Success in war could lead to political power, as Julius Caesar demonstrated when he used his loyal legions to overthrow the Republic and establish himself as dictator. But even this power came with constraints. Caesar couldn't simply rule by decree, he had to justify his actions legally, maintain the support of his soldiers, and navigate the complex web of Roman law and custom. Even absolute power in Rome required a legal framework. The Roman legal system, which evolved over centuries of military expansion, became one of Rome's most enduring legacies. Roman law distinguished between citizens and non-citizens, public and private law, and established principles like the presumption of innocence and the right to appeal. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts, they were practical tools for governing a vast empire held together by military force. When Rome conquered new territories, it extended Roman law to those regions, creating a legal framework that unified diverse peoples under a single system. Roman soldiers stationed on Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia were governed by the same laws, received the same pay, and could appeal to the same legal principles. This legal uniformity made the Roman Empire possible. But Rome also demonstrates the danger of the war-government connection. As Rome's military became more professional and soldiers became more loyal to their commanders than to the state, the Republic collapsed into civil war. Generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar used their armies to settle political disputes, turning the legions into political weapons. The result was a century of intermittent civil war that killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed the republican system. The lesson is clear. Governments created by war can also be destroyed by war. The same military force that builds order can tear it apart. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE led to political fragmentation across Europe, but it didn't end the connection between war and government. Medieval Europe was defined by decentralized feudalism, where political authority was scattered among thousands of lords, barons, and kings. But even this system was a response to military reality. In a world of constant warfare, where Viking raiders, Magyar horsemen, and Muslim armies threatened from all directions, people needed protection. They couldn't rely on a distant emperor or a professional army that no longer existed. Instead, they turned to local strongmen who could build castles, maintain armed retainers, and defend a territory. The feudal contract was explicitly military. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service. Vassals swore oaths of loyalty and promised to provide a certain number of armed knights when called upon. Peasants worked the land and in return received protection from the lord's castle and soldiers. This wasn't a government in the modern sense, but it was a form of political organization, and it was entirely based on the need for military security. Feudalism was inefficient, often chaotic, and deeply unequal, but it provided a framework for order in a violent world. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, further shaped European political development. These massive military expeditions required unprecedented coordination, logistics, and resources. Kings and popes had to negotiate with hundreds of nobles, organize supply lines stretching thousands of miles, and find ways to pay for armies in the field for years at a time. This drove innovations in taxation, administration, and law. Kings began asserting greater authority over their nobles, claiming the right to tax, conscript soldiers, and administer justice. The Crusades also brought Europeans into contact with more sophisticated Islamic and Byzantine political systems, exposing them to ideas about centralized government, professional bureaucracies, and codified law. By the late medieval period, warfare was changing in ways that would revolutionize government. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, particularly cannons and later firearms, made castles obsolete and shifted military power toward those who could afford expensive artillery and professional armies. This meant kings, who controlled the resources of entire kingdoms, rather than individual nobles, who controlled only their own estates. The result was the gradual centralization of political power and the emergence of the modern state. The 100 Years' War between England and France from 1337 to 1453 accelerated this process. Both kingdoms had to develop new forms of taxation to pay for the war, create administrative systems to manage armies and supplies, and build governmental institutions that could function continuously rather than assembling only in times of crisis. The French kings in particular used the war to expand royal authority at the expense of feudal nobles, creating a more centralized state. By the end of the war, France had a standing army, a royal bureaucracy, and a system of taxation that operated independently of feudal obligations. War had transformed France from a feudal kingdom into an early modern state. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 represents perhaps the culminating example of how war creates government structures. This devastating conflict, which killed roughly 8 million people and ravaged Central Europe, ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The Westphalian system, as it's known, established principles that still govern international relations today: the sovereignty of states, the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, and the idea that states are the primary actors in international politics. This wasn't philosophy, it was an attempt to create a legal framework that could prevent another catastrophic war. The Westphalian treaties also established the modern concept of the nation-state: a defined territory, a permanent population, a government with sovereign authority, and international recognition. Before Westphalia, Europe was a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions where the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, kings, princes, bishops, and free cities all claimed various authorities over the same people and territories. After Westphalia, the principle was clear. Within its borders, the state had supreme authority. This principle emerged directly from the need to end the chaos of religious warfare and create a stable international order. The connection between war and government continued into the modern era. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars transformed European political systems by introducing the concept of mass conscription and national mobilization. The Levy en masse, decreed by revolutionary France in 1793, called all able-bodied men to military service in defense of the nation. This created armies of unprecedented size. Napoleon commanded forces of hundreds of thousands. But it also created a new relationship between citizen and state. If the state could demand that every citizen risk their life in war, then citizens could demand rights from the state in return. The idea of citizenship, with its associated rights and responsibilities, evolved from this military compact. The American and French revolutions both illustrate how war shapes constitutional government. The American Constitution, drafted in 1787, was in part a response to the failures of the Articles of Confederation during and after the Revolutionary War. The Articles had created a weak central government that couldn't raise taxes, maintain an army, or conduct foreign policy effectively. The Constitution created a stronger federal government with the explicit power to raise armies, declare war, and regulate commerce, all lessons learned from military necessity. Similarly, the French Revolution's various constitutions all grappled with questions of military organization, conscription, and the relationship between civil and military authority. World War I demonstrates how total war creates total government. The unprecedented scale of the conflict required governments to take control of economies in ways never before attempted in peacetime democracies. Britain, France, Germany, and other combatants implemented rationing, controlled prices, directed labor, and nationalized industries. Governments expanded dramatically, creating new agencies and bureaucracies to manage war production. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers, changing social relationships and eventually contributing to women's suffrage movements. The war required such total mobilization that it fundamentally altered the relationship between citizen and state. The aftermath of World War I brought another wave of governmental innovation. The League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, represented an attempt to create an international government that could prevent future wars. Though it ultimately failed, it established principles and institutions that would be refined after World War II. The idea that international law could constrain states, that international institutions could mediate disputes, and that war itself could be illegal, were all revolutionary concepts that emerged from the trauma of the Great War. World War II and the Cold War that followed created the governmental and legal structures that define our world today. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, NATO, and countless other international institutions and legal frameworks all emerged from the experience of global conflict. The modern welfare state, with its extensive social programs and governmental services, developed in part because governments that had mobilized entire societies for war felt obligated to provide security and prosperity in peace. The GI Bill in the United States, the National Health Service in Britain, and similar programs across Europe all reflected the idea that citizens who had sacrificed for their nation deserved something in return. The nuclear age added another dimension to the war-government relationship. The existence of weapons capable of destroying civilization meant that war between major powers became unthinkable. But it also meant that governments had to develop new forms of organization, to manage this threat. Arms control treaties, hotlines between leaders, nuclear command and control systems, and intelligence agencies all emerged to manage the danger of nuclear war. The governmental apparatus created to fight wars now had to work equally hard to prevent them. Even today, in our supposedly more peaceful era, the shadow of war shapes government. The war on terror that began after September 11, 2001, has led to expansions of governmental surveillance, new legal frameworks for detention and interrogation, and organizational changes like the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. International institutions struggle with questions of intervention, sovereignty, and the responsibility to protect civilians in conflict zones. Cyber warfare raises new questions about what constitutes an attack and what response is legitimate. War, or the threat of war, continues to drive governmental evolution. So what does all this history teach us? First, that government is not a natural state of human affairs. For most of our species' existence, we lived without formal political institutions, laws, or centralized authority. We developed these things not because we're naturally inclined toward order, but because competition and conflict made them necessary. Second, that the specific forms government takes are shaped by the specific military challenges societies face. Democracy emerged in Athens because the city needed citizen soldiers. Feudalism emerged in medieval Europe because centralized authority had collapsed. The modern nation-state emerged from the need to organize resources for industrial warfare. Third, and perhaps most importantly, that there is a fundamental tension at the heart of government. It is created to protect us from violence, but it is itself based on violence. The state claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, meaning it alone can legally use violence to enforce its will. This monopoly is what makes law possible. Laws are just words unless someone can enforce them. But it also makes government dangerous. The same power that protects us from external enemies can be turned against us by our own leaders. This brings us to the deepest question. Was it worth it? We've gained security, order, and the material prosperity that complex societies make possible. We live longer, healthier lives than our prehistoric ancestors could have imagined. We have art, science, philosophy, and culture, but we've paid a terrible price. Hundreds of millions of people have died in wars throughout history. Governments have oppressed, enslaved, and murdered their own citizens. The concentration of power that makes civilization possible also makes tyranny possible. There's no easy answer to whether this trade-off was worthwhile, but it's a question we should ask. Looking forward, we face new challenges that will likely reshape government once again. Climate change, artificial intelligence, pandemics, and cyber threats don't respect national borders. They require coordination on a scale we've never achieved. Will we develop new forms of global governance to address these challenges, or will we retreat into nationalism and competition? History suggests that we'll only develop new governmental structures when crisis forces us to, when the cost of not cooperating becomes unbearable. In other words, we'll probably need another form of war, whether against the virus, against environmental collapse, or against technological threats, to create the next evolution of government. The story of how war created laws and governments is ultimately a story about us. It's about how we respond to threats, how we organize ourselves for survival, and how we try to create order in a chaotic world. It's not a comforting story. We'd like to believe that civilization emerged from our better nature, from cooperation and wisdom and foresight. But the historical record suggests something different, that we build our greatest institutions not in times of peace but in times of crisis. That we create order not from love, but from fear. That we submit to laws and governments not because we want to, but because the alternative is worse. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is that institutions created for war have sometimes transcended their violent origins. Democratic governments created to mobilize citizens for battle have become vehicles for human rights and justice. Laws designed to maintain order during conflict have evolved into systems that protect the weak and constrain the powerful. International organizations born from the ashes of world wars work to prevent future conflicts and promote cooperation. The tools we forged for destruction have been turned, sometimes, toward creation. As you go about your day following traffic laws, paying taxes, voting in elections, remember that every one of these acts connects you to this long, violent history. The government that provides your security, the laws that protect your property, the courts that settle disputes. All of these exist because somewhere in the past, people faced a threat they could only meet by organizing together. War created the first laws and governments, but we inherited them. What we do with this inheritance, whether we use these tools for oppression or liberation, for war or peace, is up to us. That's both terrifying and inspiring. We didn't choose the origins of our institutions, but we can choose their future. And that choice ultimately is what politics is about.